I came to Keth Validar on a paperwork error. That's the short version, and it's accurate enough. The long version involves a transit coordinator with 6 limbs and apparently 2 separate working memories who filed my placement documents under the wrong cohort identifier, a record system that hadn't been audited in 11 years, and a military intake officer who looked at my species designation, looked at the cohort assignment, looked back at me, and then signed the form anyway because he'd been on shift for 18 hours, and I was the last transfer in the queue. The cohort was called the Shaping Cohort. That was the official name. The cadets called it the rec bin. The drill instructors called it a necessary accounting function. You needed somewhere to put the washouts before you processed their dismissal paperwork, and the Galactic Compact Military Academy's administrative philosophy held that you should at least attempt to shape something useful out of them before writing them off. Hence the name, hence the program. Hence the survival trial that started every Shaping Cohort cycle and had, in 9 years of recorded outcomes, produced exactly 0 full completions. I didn't know any of that when I arrived. What I knew was that I was a 26-year-old wilderness search and rescue coordinator from a planet that tried very hard to kill its inhabitants on a seasonal basis, that I had been assigned to a military academy on the strength of a lateral skills recognition certificate that the Compact's recruitment office had apparently never fully understood, and that I had 3 bags, a transit hangover from 6 days of jump travel, and no idea where the intake barracks were. The first person I asked for directions was drill instructor Soveth. I didn't know he was a drill instructor. I knew he was tall Kalani run to height, and this one was well over 2.5 meters, and that he had 4 arms, a thorax etched with what I would later learn was a ceremonial scar grid indicating rank and ritual kills, and an expression that could have stripped paint. He was standing at a junction in the administrative block, reviewing a data slate, and I walked up to him with my 3 bags and asked where cohort intake was. He stared at me for a long time. The Kalani communicate a great deal through their secondary set of arms. Their primary arms handle tools, objects, fine manipulation. The secondary arms, thinner and seated lower on the torso, move constantly, a running commentary of posture and mood that their own species reads without thinking. His secondary arms went very still when I spoke to him. I later learned that in Kalani body language, that particular stillness is what you produce when you've encountered something that doesn't parse. "You are the transfer," he said. It was not a question. "Yusra Akafar," I said, "human, late arrival out of Sector 12 processing." He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, "Follow," and turned and walked, and I picked up my bags and followed him because that seemed like the reasonable response to a man who could fit 3 of me in his secondary arms alone. He walked me to the intake bay. He stood at the door while I checked in with the cohort admin, a young Telathi cadet pulling desk duty who recorded my arrival with the particular dull efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for too long. I signed what I needed to sign. I was handed a bunk assignment, a kit list, a schedule, and a document titled Shaping Cohort Survival Trial, Participant Briefing, which I tucked under my arm and didn't read until I was sitting on my bunk half an hour later. Soveth watched me check in. He watched me take my documents. He watched me shoulder my bags and walk toward the barracks corridor. Then he said behind me, in a voice that carried without any effort at all, "The trial begins in 4 days, Cadet Akafar. It has not produced a full completion in 9 years. I suggest you use those 4 days to consider whether you wish to invoke a pre-trial reassignment request." I looked back at him over my shoulder. What does a full completion require? 5 days in the Vashel Wilderness Sector. No rations. No shelter kit. Surrender at any point by activating your distress beacon removes you from the trial. Full completion is defined as reporting to the extraction point on day 5 without having activated your beacon. How many cadets usually make it to day 5? In the current cohort, I expect the number to be 0. How many in total across all 9 years? His secondary arms moved, just slightly. 11 individuals across all cohort cycles have completed the trial without beacon activation. All 11 subsequently washed out of standard academy curriculum within 2 terms. So full completion doesn't mean much. It means the subject has adequate survival instinct. It does not mean they have adequate military aptitude. I nodded at that. Good to know, I said, and went to find my bunk. I read the briefing document that evening. Then I read it again. Then I sat with it in my lap and thought about the Vashel Wilderness Sector, which the document described as a temperate to subalpine mixed zone with variable weather, native fauna classed at ecological threat level 4, no standing water sources in the primary terrain zone, and a soil chemistry that made foraging from native plant matter unreliable for non-Vashel adapted species. Threat level 4 fauna. No standing water, unreliable forage. I had spent 4 years working wilderness search and rescue in the Keldrath Highlands on Meridian Station, which maintained a threat level 6 rating for its endemic fauna, had 3 confirmed causes of death by dehydration in a zone with 12 visible water sources because the water was biologically active, and averaged 11 degrees below survivable for unprotected humans in its winter months. I had personally located and extracted 43 individuals from that terrain over those 4 years. I had also, in my second year, spent 5 days in it myself when my transit skimmer lost power in a whiteout and the extraction team couldn't reach me. 5 days, no shelter kit, no resupply. I had not thought it was fun. But I had come out of it, and I had come out of it with notes. I put the briefing document in my kit bag and went to sleep. The next 4 days I spent learning the cohort. There were 29 of them. Mix of species, mostly Telathi, a compact bipedal species with excellent low-light vision, and a digestive system optimized for high-calorie density food, meaning they did poorly on restricted intake. 4 Sauron, arthropod-adjacent, excellent climbers but poorly adapted to temperature variation. 3 Malkrine, tall and slow metabolizing, which should theoretically make them good at endurance, except that their slow metabolism also meant slow core temperature regulation. And 1 other human, a 17-year-old named Dax Pruitt from a compact colony world, who had never been in a wilderness zone in his life, and who shook my hand with a grip like a nervous sparrow, and said he was very glad to meet me. I was also glad to meet him. I sat down with him that first afternoon, and we had a frank conversation about what the next 5 days were going to require. The briefing says no rations, he said. That's right. What do we eat? Whatever we can find and process. The briefing also says the forage is unreliable. Unreliable for non-adapted species means the local plants won't nourish you well. It doesn't mean everything out there is inert. You have to know what you're looking at. I paused. Can you build a fire? He looked at me the way people look at you when they're trying to assess whether you're serious. From scratch. From scratch. No. Do you know how to read terrain for water? No. Can you identify edible invertebrate protein when you see it? I've never tried. Okay, I said. We have 4 days, let's use them. I spent those 4 days doing 3 things. First, I ran every cross-species simulation available in the Academy's field prep module, the survival scenarios, the terrain navigation exercises, the ecological threat assessments, and I ran them faster than the module expected, which earned me some automated flags that the cohort admin ignored because nobody in the Shaping Cohort was supposed to be running field prep simulations. Second, I ran Dax through the basics: fire by friction, terrain water reading, protein identification, shelter construction from available material. He was a quick learner once he understood I was serious. By day 3, he could make a functional shelter in under 20 minutes and start a fire in under 5, which wasn't fast but was survivable. Third, I introduced myself to every cadet in the cohort and paid attention. What I was paying attention to was capability. What could each of them do? What did their biology suggest they'd need? Where were the gaps? The Telathi were going to be hungry by day 2 and cognitively impaired by day 3 if they didn't get caloric input. The Sauran were going to be dangerously cold if the temperature dropped at night, which the briefing said it would. The Malkreen were going to be fine for 3 days and then hit a wall when their slow metabolism finally processed the energy deficit. What all of them shared was a thorough institutional confidence that the trial was going to break them, because it always had, and that confidence was going to cost them as much as the terrain. Soveth observed all of this from a distance. I saw him watching the simulation runs. I saw him watching my sessions with Dax. He never intervened. He never commented. His secondary arms moved through the whole range of what I would eventually learn to read as his private inventory of responses, curiosity, assessment, something that might have been reconsideration. But he said nothing directly to me after that first exchange in the administrative corridor. On the evening before the trial, he called the full cohort to the briefing room and gave his standard address. I sat in the second row and listened. He was good at it. The Kalani have a quality in ceremonial address that translates across most species, a combination of physical authority and controlled vocal resonance that tends to produce attention without requiring any particular content. His secondary arms were precisely still. His primary arms were clasped at his lower back. He stood at the front of the room and delivered the statement of the trial's history, the numbers, the outcomes, the single operational rule: activate your beacon and you leave the field. Do not activate your beacon and you may stay. Then he said, the Vashal sector does not care about your classification level. It does not care about your species adaptation. It does not care about your scores on academy assessments. It produces one outcome for unprepared cadets, and that outcome is consistent across 9 years of trial cycles. I expect most of you to activate your beacons within the first 48 hours. I expect a small number to endure to 72 hours. I do not expect any of you to reach the extraction point. He paused, his eyes tracked across the room. They stopped on me. Any questions before tomorrow's insertion? Nobody spoke for a moment. Then I raised my hand. Cadet Akafer. Sir, I said, when you say you don't expect any of us to reach the extraction point, does that factor in the full cohort or just individual performance? His secondary arms moved. The trial is not a team exercise. Individual cadets operate independently. I understand that's the design. I'm asking whether historical outcome data accounts for cohort-wide cooperative performance. A long pause. It does not. Historical cohorts have not demonstrated cohort-wide cooperative performance. Thank you, I said. He looked at me for 3 seconds, then he dismissed the room. The trial inserted at 600 the following morning. Transit pods dropped 30 cadets, 29 cohort members plus me, at staggered entry points across the Vashal sector's primary zone. I had a beacon, a compass, a set of Academy standard thermal underlayers, and a knife. The thermal underlayers were good quality. The knife was a standard issue compact field blade, 7 inches, full tang, adequate edge. I also had a mental map of the terrain zone built from 4 days of simulation review, a species-by-species caloric deficit timeline I had worked out the night before and memorized, and the location of Dax's drop point, which I had checked against the insertion manifest before departure and committed to memory, along with the drop coordinates for 3 of the more vulnerable Telathi cadets. I was on the ground for approximately 4 minutes before I had a fire going, water processing, and a rough shelter outline picked. Then I went to find Dax. He was 340 meters northeast of my drop point, which was within the range the insertion manifest had indicated. He had managed to get a fire started just barely, and it was producing more smoke than heat, which told me he was using wet-side timber, but he'd picked a reasonable site, a natural windbreak, south-facing, reasonable drainage. I revised his fire, showed him what he'd done wrong with the timber selection, and spent 20 minutes helping him build a real shelter. Then I said, "I'm going to find the Talathi. Stay here, keep the fire going, and watch for Soren. They'll come to the heat tonight when the temperature drops." "Are we allowed to do this?" he asked. "The rule is don't activate your beacon. There's no rule about moving through the sector." He thought about that. What if an instructor sees us working together? The trial is an individual survival assessment. We're not fighting each other's battles. We're making sure people don't die. Dax nodded slowly. Then he said, "Okay, where do I look for protein?" I told him, then I moved. The first Talathi cadet I found was a female named Asith, crouched at the edge of a stream drainage, which told me she could read terrain well enough to find water but didn't know what to do with it. She tried to drink directly from the stream, and the Vashel sector briefing was very clear that surface water in the zone ran high in biological particulate that required processing before ingestion. She was already showing early signs of gastrointestinal distress. I built her a processing setup from the materials at hand. The sector had adequate fire-starting material once you knew the dry-side timber from the wet, and the processing method I used was simple thermal cycling through a vessel improvised from a section of bark lined with stripped foliage, and sat with her while the first processed water ran. While we waited, I showed her where to look for the subsurface fauna that would give her the caloric density her metabolism needed. She was quiet for most of it. When the water was ready, she drank carefully, and then she said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because if I leave you here without solving the water problem, you activate your beacon by nightfall, and I lose a cadet." She processed that. Her species' eyes are large and very dark, structured for low-light vision, and they tend to give an impression of steady, unblinking attention that humans often find disconcerting. She watched me the way I had watched the briefing document, twice, carefully, trying to extract everything it contained. "You're collecting us," she said. "I'm trying to get 30 cadets to the extraction point." "That has never been done." "I know. You believe you can do it. I think we have the collective capability to do it if the capability is organized. Individually, most of you will fail. Together, with the right distribution of knowledge and task sharing, I think there's a path." I paused. The drill instructor said historical cohorts haven't demonstrated cohort-wide cooperative performance. "We never tried." "Right." She stood up. Her secondary motion, Talathi used their upper shoulder group for the same communicative function as Kalani's secondary arms. A subtle shift of the shoulder blades indicated something I didn't have enough vocabulary yet to read precisely. Later I would learn it was the posture of someone who has just made a decision. "Tell me where to go," she said. By midday of the first day, I had located and stabilized 9 of the 30 cadets. 5 Talathi, 3 Soren who had clustered near a rocky elevation, and 1 Malkrine who had already built herself a shelter of impressive structural quality, and was sitting in it eating a pile of subsurface larvae she dug up from the base of a tree line. The Malkrine, her name was Vethara, looked at me when I arrived at her site, looked at the 9 cadets I'd brought with me and said, "You are the human from the intake documents." Yusra Akefir. "The transfer error." "That's right." She looked at the group again. Her species' face is configured in a way that doesn't translate well to human emotional reading. Flat nasal structure, wide-set eyes, a thin horizontal expression line where most species have a mouth, but she had a quality of stillness that reminded me of the intake officer who had signed my form without argument. The stillness of someone doing rapid math. "You know what you are doing," she said. It was not a question. "Some of it," I said. I could use help with the parts I don't know. Which parts? Sector-specific ecology. I have general wilderness training, but the Vashel zone has some specifics I've been working from simulations. Simulations don't always capture the real variation. Vithara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The larvae in this soil band are the highest density protein source in this sector. The distribution pattern indicates a substrate type that also produces a specific root fiber, not primary nutrition, but useful for water filtration if the bark vessel method is too slow." "Show me." She did. We spent 2 hours in productive cross-reference, her ecological knowledge of Vashel-type environments layering onto my processing and shelter methodology, while the rest of the group organized itself into task assignments. Asith ran water processing. 2 of the Soren, who turned out to have excellent climbing ability and a talent for reading structural weakness in deadfall timber, handled shelter extension. Dax, who arrived at mid-afternoon having followed my directional markers, took over the fire management for the new camp we'd established at a consolidated site in the windbreak zone. By sunset of day 1, we had 22 cadets in one location. The other 8 I marked on my mental map as requiring a sweep the following morning. 2 of the Telathi had dropped at the sector's far edge and would take 3 hours to reach. The night was cold, exactly as cold as the briefing had indicated. Sector temperature drop of approximately 12 degrees from the day's peak, which put it below the comfort threshold for the Soren and at the lower edge of tolerance for most of the Telathi. We had built a fire large enough and a wind shelter deep enough to maintain survivable ambient temperature for the group, and I had arranged the sleeping positions so the most cold-sensitive individuals were center cluster, and the Malkreen, who tolerated cold best, were at the perimeter. I didn't sleep much. I rotated fire watch every 2 hours, taking 3 of the 4-hour stretches myself, and used the quiet time to review what I knew and what I didn't. The fire watch was its own kind of accounting. In the Meridian Station Highlands you learn to use the still hours, the ones between 200 and 500 when the world is at its quietest, and your own thinking is sharpest in the particular way that comes from exhaustion rather than rest, to process what the day produced, what worked, what nearly didn't, what you do differently. I ran that process now with the camp laid out around me, and the fires burning low and steady, and the sector dark beyond the windbreak, and what I concluded was that the framework was sound but the margin was thinner than I wanted. 28 cadets, each with a specific metabolic timeline and a specific capability set and a specific failure mode. I was carrying the map of all of it in my head, and the map had to stay accurate through day 5 or the whole structure degraded. What I didn't know was what day 3 looked like for the Malkreen. Vithara's metabolism would hold through day 4 on current intake, but I had 3 Malkreen in the group, and the other 2 were younger than her and had been on reduced intake since the morning. The margin was thin. I needed more caloric density for the whole group, and the larvae beds Vithara had shown me were going to be depleted within another day of harvesting. I also didn't know if Sovith was watching. The answer I found out later was yes. The Academy maintained a drone surveillance network across the Vashel sector during trials, passive recording, not intervention. Drill instructors could access the feed, but were not permitted to intervene in trial events unless a beacon was activated, or a cadet's life was at risk beyond the threshold defined as trial acceptable. The threshold was generous. The Academy's legal position was that candidates accepted the trial risk at enrollment. Sovith had accessed the feed at 1400 on day 1, shortly after his automated monitoring system flagged an anomalous pattern. Instead of cadets distributing randomly across the sector and the distress beacons beginning to light up at the expected rate, 22 signals were clustered in a single location, and 0 beacons had been activated. He watched the feed for a long time. I know this because he told me later. He said he watched me build the first water processing station. He watched me run the route between Asith's initial location and the consolidated campsite. He watched me conduct the species-by-species orientation session I ran with the full group in the late afternoon, where I went through what each of them needed nutritionally and physically, and how we were going to address it over the next 4 days. He said he watched that session twice. He said he did not call anyone or file a report. He said he sat in the monitoring room with the feed running and his secondary arms very still. Day 2, I ran the far edge sweep and brought in the remaining 8. One of them, a Talathi male named Seth, had activated his beacon at 3:30 and been extracted. 29 cadets remaining. The sweep took until noon and covered terrain that the simulations hadn't fully represented. The eastern edge of the Vashel sector had a drainage feature that wasn't on the published maps, a shallow fen that was navigable but required knowing where the solid substrate ran beneath the surface water. I found the solid line by reading the vegetation pattern, which was consistent with how similar features behaved on Meridian Station, and I used the same method to navigate the cadets I was collecting back through it. The cadets I collected on the far edge sweep were in varying condition. 2 Talathi females who had found each other on the night of insertion and camped together, intelligent instinct, even without guidance, had done well enough, though they were hungry and their shelter had been structurally marginal. A young Sauran male who had spent the night in a rock crevice at the elevation edge, which was cold but dry and structurally sound, was physically fine but had eaten nothing since insertion and was visibly calculating whether continuing was rational. I gave each of them the same information, where the consolidated camp was, what resources were there, what the next 4 days required. I did not frame it as encouragement. I framed it as logistics. Cadets who believe they are being motivated tend to discount the information and parse the tone. Cadets who believe they are being briefed tend to listen. The Sauran male, his name was Fenath, and he had a habit of asking clarifying questions in a rapid, precise series that I came to appreciate over the following days, asked me, while we were navigating back through the fen, how I knew the substrate line was holding. Vegetation root depth, I said. The plants that grow in wet substrate have shallow, horizontal root systems. The plants in solid substrate grow deeper and vertical. The surface water obscures the ground, but the plant architecture tells you what's underneath. How do you know that? I learned it in a fen that tried to kill me on Meridian Station. He considered this. Did it succeed? Not that time. He was quiet for a moment, both his primary limbs testing the substrate ahead of him with the instinctive precision of a species that evolved in complex vertical terrain. You have been in situations where it did not succeed multiple times, he said. It was less a question than a category he was assigning me to. That's the job description for search and rescue, I said. You go into the bad place repeatedly, and you learn from each time. The academy curriculum describes field experience as cumulative advantage, he said. Most cadets have very little. Most cadets haven't had the opportunity yet. You are not most cadets. No, I said, I'm a paperwork error. He processed that for 2 steps. The paperwork error placed the highest capability individual in this cohort into the group that was expected to fail. Seems like it. That is, he said, with the careful enunciation of someone who has found the precise word in a second language, extremely inconvenient for the institution's expectations. I didn't argue with that. The far edge sweep also produced one moment I hadn't anticipated. The second to last cadet I located, a Malkrine female named Sethara who had been dropped at the sector's furthest entry point, had not been idle. She had built a shelter of such structural quality that it looked like something from a field construction manual. Perfect orientation, excellent insulation layering, a functional rainwater collection channel cut into the entry approach. She had spent 20 hours alone in bad terrain and had apparently decided that if she was going to be there, she was going to do it correctly. She looked at the group I had brought with me and then at me and said, "You are collecting people." "Yes." "I assumed someone would come," she said, not proudly, just as a statement of prior calculation. The insertion pattern creates isolation as a design assumption. The correct counter is consolidation. I did not have the information I needed to initiate it myself, so I built for the assumption that consolidation would occur. "That's good thinking," I said. "It is obvious," she said, with the particular Malkrine quality of delivering a negative self-assessment without any apparent distress. I should have initiated the consolidation myself. I did not have the terrain knowledge. "That's why we're here," I said. "Between the people in this group we have enough terrain knowledge. Individually you might not, collectively we do." Sethara looked at the group again, the Sauran and Talathi cadets who had come in with me, the varied species and capability sets, the visible evidence of 4 days of outdoor living that every one of them was carrying. Then she looked back at me. "Lead," she said, and she picked up her kit and joined the column. One of the Sauran I picked up on the eastern sweep. A male named Karthais had gotten himself into a confrontation with one of the Vashel sector's threat level 4 fauna. He had climbed a tree to get away from it, which was the correct instinct for a Sauran and a reasonable response to a threat level 4 predator, and he had been in the tree for approximately 6 hours and was hungry and cold and quietly furious with himself. The predator, a ground ambush type, low and wide, with a sensory array that Karthais said had tracked his heat signature through the tree bark, was still at the base of the tree when I arrived. The creature was roughly the dimensions of a large terrestrial felid, but built lower to the ground, all weight in the hindquarters, with a broad armored skull and 4 sensory cluster organs arranged in a bilateral pattern across its face. It had positioned itself to deny Karthais any viable descent path, not actively threatening, but patient in the way that ambush predators are patient. It had time. Karthais was going to have to come down eventually. I had the knife. I also had the ecology notes from Vethara, who had mentioned that the ground ambush predators in the Vashel sector were territorial and would not pursue past the edge of their established range if presented with a direct threat from a larger organism. The complication was that I was significantly smaller than the predator, which ran approximately twice my body mass, and the Vashel sector's threat assessors had presumably classed it at level 4 for a reason. I walked up to it. I want to be precise about this. I did not charge it, I did not wave my arms, I did not attempt any kind of dramatic confrontation. I walked toward it at a measured, deliberate pace, made direct eye contact with its primary visual organ, a bilateral arrangement of sensor clusters set into a broad, flat skull that angled toward me as I approached, and stopped at approximately 3 meters, close enough that it had to make a decision. It had been still during my approach, the kind of still that predators achieve when they're evaluating whether to strike. Ground ambush types are optimized for the burst from concealment. The pursuit predator's patience for a prolonged threat assessment is lower. I was counting on that. The stillness between us lasted longer than I expected. 12 seconds, 15. The creature's sensor clusters were locked on me with the complete, unblinking focus of something that was trying to categorize what it was looking at. I had the impression, and I acknowledge this is projection, of genuine uncertainty on its part. It had a taxonomy for prey. It had a taxonomy for competitors of comparable size. It apparently did not have a ready taxonomy for something my size that walked toward it and stopped at 3 meters and looked back at it without moving. After about 15 seconds it moved, laterally, not toward me, a slow repositioning that took it off the direct line between me and the tree. That was the territorial edge behavior Vethara had described, the acknowledgement of a competing claim without full retreat. I stepped into the space it had vacated, put myself between it and the tree, and said to Karthais, "Come down." He came down. We walked back toward the main camp. The predator watched us go. Carthais didn't say anything for the first 100 meters. Then he said, "You knew it would move." I thought it probably would. Vethara briefed us on the behavioral pattern. What would you have done if it hadn't? Use the knife, I said, but I was hoping not to. He was quiet for a moment. What does hoping not to look like? It looks like walking up to it slowly enough that it had time to choose retreat. He thought about that for the rest of the walk back. Day 2 ended with 29 cadets in camp. Dax had expanded the shelter complex in my absence, and Vethara had organized a second larvae bed harvest. The camp was functional, not comfortable but functional. Fires burning, water processing cycling, shelter adequate for the night temperature. I ran a quick status check on each species group, identified the 3 Malkrine as the most nutritionally marginal, and had Vethara prioritize their caloric intake for the following morning, and then sat down with my back against the main windbreak timber and did my own physical inventory. What I noticed, sitting there, was the camp sound. Not silence. There were fires and processing equipment, and the low ambient noise of 29 beings doing the various things required by their biology at the end of a hard day. But the noise had a particular quality I recognized from the Meridian Station mountain posts, the sound of people who have stopped waiting to be told what to do and started doing it. Feneth was running a technical review of the water processing setup with 2 other Sauron, the 3 of them working through the filtration methodology in the rapid exchange shorthand of minds that like problems. Oseth was directing 2 Telathi cadets in the preparation of the second larvae harvest. Sethara and Vethara were in quiet conference about the following day's caloric planning. Sethara's construction manual shelter logic meeting, Vethara's ecological knowledge in what looked, from 20 meters away, like a productive negotiation. It was not the camp I had arrived at. It was a camp that had organized itself around a shared problem with the tools I had given it. That was different and better, and the difference mattered. My feet were fine. My core temperature was fine. I was low on calories myself. I'd been running the sector for 2 days and eating at the bottom of the group priority list by choice, and I could feel the deficit starting to register. I ate a double portion of the larvae and some processed root fiber and went asleep. Day 3 was the crisis day. The Telathi hit their cognitive wall at approximately 800, which was within the timeline I'd projected. The way it expressed itself was not in collapse but in withdrawal, a species-specific response to nutritional stress that looked, from the outside, like reluctance to engage. They would answer questions but wouldn't initiate. They moved when directed but didn't self-organize. Oseth, who had been running water processing with consistent competence for 2 days, sat down next to her station and stared at it. I put 3 of the Sauron on larvae harvesting and had them delivered directly to the Telathi before anything else was distributed. It took 4 hours to bring them back to functional cognition. 4 hours where the rest of the camp ran on the organizational momentum we had built, and I didn't have to direct much, which was how I knew we had actually built something rather than created a dependency. The Malkrine wall hit at noon. 3 cadets who had been the most physically capable individuals in the group for 2.5 days suddenly became slow, quiet, and increasingly difficult to communicate with. Vethara had warned me it would happen. Her own metabolism was hitting it, too. I could see it in the deliberate, considered way she was moving, the extra fraction of a second between thought and action. She kept working. She was the most professional individual I had encountered in the entire academy intake process, and I told her so. "You are polite," she said. "I mean it." She looked at me with those flat, wide-set eyes. "You are also running a deficit." "I'm fine. You have been eating last for 3 days. I've been managing my intake. You have been deprioritizing your intake in favor of group stability." She paused. "I am telling you that your judgment capacity will degrade before you recognize the degradation. I have seen this pattern in field conditions. Eat now. I ate. It was not easy to argue with Vithara. In retrospect, I am glad I didn't try. Day 3's other event was the storm. The sector briefing had noted variable weather, and variable weather was a polite description of what arrived at 1600. A fast-moving frontal system that dropped the temperature by 9 degrees in under an hour, brought horizontal wind, and produced rain that was just cold enough to carry a hypothermia risk for the Sauron and the Telathi if they weren't sheltered. We were sheltered. We had built for this, not specifically for this storm, but for the principle of it. The main shelter structure could hold 22 cadets out of direct contact with the wind. The overflow extension Dax had built could hold the remaining 7. The fires needed constant management in the wind, but the windbreak timber worked the way it was supposed to, and we kept them alive. I ran shelter maintenance for 4 straight hours in the rain. Karthais ran it with me. His Sauron climbing ability made him faster than me on the structure reinforcement. He could reach the upper sections of the frame in seconds, find the failing points by feel, and fix them with a speed I couldn't match from the ground. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. At one point he looked over at me from the upper frame section, rain running off his carapace, and said, "Do you do this often? Build shelters in the rain? All of this, organize people in a bad situation." I thought about it. "This is what I did for a living," I said, "before the academy." "Search and rescue." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, both upper limbs working a joint in the frame that had loosened. "The instructors think we will all fail." "I know. That does not bother you." "It gives us room to work," I said. "Nobody who expects you to succeed is watching closely enough to help. Nobody who expects you to fail is watching closely enough to interfere." He finished the joint, tested it, came back down the frame. "You thought about this before the trial?" "A little. More than a little." I didn't argue with that either. The storm passed before dawn. Day 4 arrived clear and cold, with that particular quality of morning light that comes after bad weather, sharp and clean, and honest about distances. I ran my camp inventory and found 29 cadets in functional condition. Not comfortable, not fed well enough for anyone to be at full cognitive and physical capacity, but functional, upright, oriented, capable of movement and decision-making and assigned task execution. The extraction point was 14 kilometers northwest. I called the group together in the morning light and laid out the route. The terrain between our consolidated camp and the extraction point was a mix of open sector and 2 significant elevation changes, 1 climb, 1 descent, with the fen drainage I'd navigated on day 2 cutting across the western approach. The fen was the variable. I knew how to read it now. The cadets didn't. I organized the march column by species thermal tolerance and terrain navigation confidence. Malkreen on the outside edges, where their cold tolerance compensated for the wind exposure on the elevation sections. Telathi in the center cluster. Sauron distributed through the column because their climbing instinct made them natural scouts for the rough sections. Dax and I running fore and aft sweep. I explained the fen navigation to the full group in 20 minutes, and then walked them through it at the speed of the slowest member, which was a Malkreen cadet named Osavith who had been the most nutritionally marginal all week, and was moving carefully but steadily. The climb was hard. I won't pretend it wasn't. 4 days of reduced intake and broken sleep meant that every cadet in that column, including me, was working on reserve, and the elevation gain was enough to require genuine effort from everyone. The Telathi struggled most on the climb. I ran back down the column twice to walk next to cadets who were slowing, not to carry them, but to give them something to pace off. Vithara came up beside me at one point on the upper section, and walked the steep grade with the deliberate, economical movement of someone who has been cold and hungry before, and knows that panic costs more than the terrain does. The descent was easier physically but harder technically. The lower section had loose substrate where the weather had saturated the slope face, and I had to pick the line carefully and run it twice before bringing the column through. Carthies went first with me, his Sauron foot placement making him a better technical guide than I was on that specific surface. We marked the safe line together and then brought the group down in pairs. The fen I navigated by the vegetation reading I developed on day 2, calling out the substrate line as I saw it, and having the column follow at 10-meter spacing. 2 cadets needed correction mid-crossing. Their angle had drifted toward the soft substrate, but we caught it before it became a problem. We cleared the fen at 1340. The extraction point was a flat clearing 3 kilometers further, marked by a compact beacon tower, and I could see it from the fen's western edge. I could also see the 2 Academy transport vehicles parked beside it, and the figures standing near them. One of the figures was Soveth, I could tell from the height. We covered the 3 kilometers in 41 minutes. The terrain was open and relatively flat, and the column moved well on it. The psychological effect of being able to see the endpoint was real, and even the most depleted cadets found something in that last stretch. Osavith, who had been the column's slowest member for most of the day, walked into the extraction clearing under her own power with her spine straight and her chin level. I counted everyone in. 29 cadets at the extraction point. No beacons activated. The one activation had been Seth at 3:30 on night 1, and that had been before I'd reached him. Soveth watched us come in. He stood at the edge of the clearing with his data slate in one primary hand and his secondary arms very still. The Academy medics moved through the column behind us, running the standard post-trial assessment protocol, biometrics, nutrition status, condition flags, and the administrative officer began recording the completion data, and I stood at the edge of all of it and let it happen around me because I was, at that point, extremely tired. Dax came and stood next to me. He was sunburned across his nose and one cheek, which is what happens to fair-complexioned colonists who spend 4 days outdoors in a sector they've never been in before, and he had the look of someone who has just discovered what their limits actually are and found them further out than they expected. He didn't say anything. We stood together and watched the medics work. After a while, Soveth walked over. He stood in front of me with his data slate held at rest position, and his 4 arms arranged in what I had come to recognize as formal posture, primary arms symmetric at his sides, secondary arms folded in a specific configuration I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. His expression was the same one I had first seen in the administrative corridor, the unreadable one. 29 completions, he said. 29 present, I said. I had 1 extraction on night 1. I didn't reach him in time. You were attempting to reach him. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. His secondary arms shifted. You understood the trial's design, he said. The insertion pattern creates isolation. The terrain creates attrition. The timeline exploits species-specific metabolic limitations. The design assumes individual response which is consistently inadequate. He paused. You identified the design assumption and built against it. It seemed like the obvious response. In 9 years, it was not obvious to any previous cohort. They may not have had the background for it, I said. Search and rescue is basically the same problem set. You have a group of individuals in bad terrain with degrading capability and a fixed extraction point and a time constraint. You organize the group around the collective capability and you move. Soveth looked at me for a long moment. His secondary arms moved through a configuration I hadn't seen before, both of them slightly extended, angled outward, palms presented. I didn't know what it meant. Later, when I asked him, he told me it was the posture Kalani instructors use when they're looking at something they need to reclassify. The trial was designed to assess individual survival capacity, he said. I know. It assessed something else today. Yes. He looked down at the data slate. He tapped something on it. Then he said, "The administrative reclassification will take 72 hours. All 29 cadets are reclassified to standard curriculum cohort pending physical clearance." He looked up. "The reclassification will note the circumstances of this trial cycle. The record will be accurate." What does accurate look like? 29 completions. First full cohort completion in 9 years. Organized field leadership by a human transfer cadet, Shaping Cohort Cycle 44. I thought about that. Does the reclassification to standard curriculum include me? "You are already misclassified," he said. "You were placed in the Shaping Cohort in error. The correct reclassification is a separate document." What does the correct reclassification look like? He tapped the data slate again. "I am filing it now," he said. "The recommendation field currently contains more text than is standard for the format." I looked at him. "What does the recommendation say?" His secondary arms moved into that extended configuration again. "It says that the Compact Military Academy's standard field leadership curriculum was completed, in practical terms, before the cadet in question was enrolled in the program that teaches it." He paused. "It also recommends curriculum review." I was quiet for a moment. The medics were finishing their rounds. The transport vehicles were being prepped. Dax was sitting on a piece of cleared timber near the beacon tower, having his biometrics run by a young Telathi medic who kept looking at him with an expression I was starting to be able to read as a mix of professional assessment and something like awe. "Is there a second trial?" I asked. Soveth looked at me. "In the standard curriculum," I said, "after the Shaping Cohort survival trial, is there a second field assessment?" "There is a combined species tactics practicum at the end of the first term," he said slowly. "It is considered significantly more demanding than the Shaping Cohort trial." "Good," I said. He looked at me for another moment. Then he looked out at the clearing, at the 29 cadets being processed, at Vethara sitting with her back straight, and her eyes half closed in the efficient rest posture I'd watched her use every spare moment of the last 4 days, at Karthais going over the structural details of the day's route with 2 of the other Soren cadets, with the focused attention of someone filing things away for next time, at Asith sitting quietly with a ration pack in her hands and water in her eyes that she wasn't quite blinking away. "Your transfer file," he said, "notes your species as human, your origin as Meridian Station, and your prior occupation as Wilderness Search and Rescue Coordinator. It does not note anything else. That's accurate as far as it goes." "It does not note," he said, "that Meridian Station's wilderness zones are classed at ecological threat level 6. "No," I said, "it doesn't." His secondary arm stilled again. That particular stillness, the one I had first seen in the administrative corridor, in the moment before he decided I was worth walking to the intake bay. The stillness of something that doesn't parse, encountering the variable it missed. "What is the primary cause of cadet fatality in a threat level 6 wilderness zone?" he asked. "Complacency," I said. "The terrain is hard enough that the cadets who survive it get confident, and then they stop accounting for what they don't know." He considered that. "And what did you do to prevent complacency in this cohort?" "I kept us hungry," I said. "There was plenty of protein in that sector, actually, more than I told them. I could have fed everyone to full satiation by day 2. I paused. "But comfortable people stop paying attention. And in bad terrain, the moment you stop paying attention is the moment the terrain costs you something." The silence that followed was long enough that one of the transport crews walked past us with a supply crate and nodded to Soveth and went on their way. "You rationed the group deliberately," he said. "I managed the intake. There's a difference. Nobody was at risk. Everyone was functional." But functional and satisfied are different operational states, and I needed them functional and attentive. Soveth looked out at the clearing again. His data slate was in one primary hand, and I could see him making notes on it, but his attention was not on the screen. "The practicum," he said. "The first term combined tactics assessment." "Yes." "The historical completion rate is 63%, higher than the Shaping Cohort trial. By design, it draws from cadets who have already survived a filter." "I know." "You are not concerned." It wasn't a question. I answered it anyway. "I'm concerned about the same things I was concerned about in the Vashel sector," I said. "What I don't know yet, what the design assumption is and how to build against it. What the specific gaps are in each cadet's capability set." "The practicum involves 41 cadets across 6 cohorts," he said. "You will not know most of them." 4 days is enough time, I said. He looked at me then, a direct, measuring look with his primary visual set, unfiltered by the formal distance he'd maintained across most of our exchanges. The secondary arms moved into that extended configuration again, held it, then folded. "I will ensure your transfer reclassification is filed before you reach the medical bay," he said. "The cohort reclassification paperwork I will complete tonight." "Thank you, sir." He turned to go, then he stopped. "Cadet Akafer." "Sir?" "The question you asked on the evening before the trial. Whether historical outcome data accounted for cohort-wide cooperative performance." "Yes." "I have been an instructor at this academy for 14 years, he said. "In 14 years, that question has not been asked before the Shaping Cohort trial." I thought about that. Was it a useful question? His secondary arms moved one final time, a slow, deliberate extension. Both arms held for 2 full seconds, then folded precisely back. "It was the correct question," he said. He walked back to the transport vehicles. I watched him go. Then I turned back to the clearing and found Vethara watching me with those dark, large-set Malkrine eyes, patient and still and assessing. "He respects you," she said. "He respects the outcome," I said. "That's not the same thing." On the contrary, she tilted her head in the Malkrine gesture I had learned by then to read as measured disagreement. "Soveth has been an instructor for 14 years. He has had outcomes before. He does not have whatever he thinks you are." She paused. "He is not certain what to put in the taxonomy field." I looked back at the transport vehicles, where Soveth was now in conversation with the administrative officer, his data slate moving. "I'm a search and rescue coordinator," I said. "There's a taxonomy for that." "Yes," Vethara said, "but the question is not what you are. The question is what you do to a room when you are in it." I didn't have an answer for that. The medical clearance took 3 hours. The transport back to the main academy campus took another 2. I spent most of it asleep against the side wall of the transport bay, which is not dignified but was absolutely necessary. And when I woke up, we were on final approach, and Dax was sitting across from me eating a full ration pack, with the concentrated focus of someone who has been hungry for 4 days and is making up for it methodically. He looked up when I moved. "You slept," he said. "Yes." "You didn't sleep much out there." "No." He thought about that. "Were you worried?" "About what specifically?" "About whether it would work, the plan." I considered the question. Outside the transport's viewport, the academy campus was spreading out below us, the complex of training grounds and academic blocks and administrative towers that would, if the reclassification went through, be my operating environment for the next several terms. "I was thinking about what would go wrong," I said. "That's different from worried. Worry is what you do when you've run out of things to plan for. I hadn't run out yet." Dax nodded slowly. "When did you run out?" "About halfway through the Fen crossing on day 4, I said. "After that I was just walking." He laughed at that, a short, surprised laugh that loosened something in the transport bay. 2 of the Sauran cadets looked over. Karthais, who had been sitting with his eyes closed, opened them and looked at Dax and then at me with that soaring quality of attentiveness that I was coming to appreciate. They didn't miss anything, and they didn't perform attention. They just had it. "What happens in the tactics practicum?" Dax asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I'll find out." He thought about that. Then he said with a certainty that surprised me, "I want to be in your cohort." "We'll see what the assignments look like." "I want to be in your cohort," he said again, not arguing, just stating it the way you state a fact that you're confident in. I looked at him, this 17-year-old colony kid, who had arrived at the intake bay with a grip like a nervous sparrow, and was now sitting in a military transport after 4 days in a threat level 4 wilderness zone, looking like he'd found something he hadn't expected to find. "Work on your fire starting speed," I said. "You're still too slow on the initial strike." He smiled. "Yes, sir." "I'm not a sir." "No," he said, "but you're going to be." I didn't argue with that either. Outside the viewport, the academy campus came into final resolution. The clean, functional architecture of a serious institution, all polished metal and geometric precision, built by species who had been making war and learning from it for longer than humanity had been writing things down. I was a paperwork error who had been placed in the wreck bin by a 6-limb transit coordinator with 2 working memories, and signed in by an officer who had been on shift too long to question the file. The reclassification was going to correct that, technically. But I had 4 days before the first term started, and 28 cadets who were now standard curriculum, and 1 human kid who needed to work on his fire starting speed, and a first-term tactics practicum with a 63% completion rate and design assumptions I hadn't identified yet. Plenty of time. I closed my eyes again as the transport settled onto the landing pad, and I thought about what I didn't know yet, and I started to plan.